Hello viewers and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we are talking about the Mount Rushmore State, South Dakota. South Dakota gets its name from the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota tribes, which make up the Sioux Nation, which historically occupied the area that is today the Dakotas. This state is of course also famous for Mount Rushmore, where carvings of 4 presidential faces were cut into the Black Hills of the western part of South Dakota over a period of about 14 years, from 1927 to 1941. What fewer people know about the state, though, is that there is another carving that is currently underway, under construction in the state, and has been that way since 1948. It is called the Crazy Horse Memorial Carving. Upon completion, it would depict a Lakota warrior named Crazy Horse sitting atop his horse and pointing to the distance. But in 72 years' time, since 1948, when construction began, the only part that's been completed is the head. So it seems unlikely that the project will ever get done, but if completed, it would become the largest mountain carving in the United States. South Dakota's population is relatively low, and it is in fact the 5th least densely populated state in the country. Therefore, it only has one congressional district covering the entire state. The district is currently represented by Republican Dusty Johnson, who is wrapping up his first term as representative of the state, and he is running again this November. As of this video, he has already defeated a primary challenger, so he is definitely going to be on the ticket against a likely Democratic opponent. A little extra trivia about the seat. Johnson's predecessor was a woman named Kristi Noem, who is currently the governor of South Dakota. Noem is also a Republican. However, prior to Noem's first term representing South Dakota, the seat was held by a Democrat for about 3.5 terms. So over the last decade, we've seen pretty much exclusively Republican representation in the state. Is that reflected in the raw U.S. House turnout numbers? Let's look at my first graph and find out. So yeah, looking here, we're seeing Republican voters really breaking away from Democrats in a pretty dramatic way. Kristi Noem won her first election in 2010 to represent the state, and as you can see, for that year it was by the narrowest of margins. But in the years since then, we see greater turnout from Republicans and worse turnout for Democrats, which is better illustrated by those trend lines that you can see, those dotted lines, where the Republicans have a positive slope and the Democrats have a negative slope. So tossing that graph aside, I think it's pretty clear from this data that Dusty Johnson is likely to coast to a second term this November. South Dakota's at-large district is just not competitive at this time, so let's make that official and put it on our first map. Mark it. Moving right along, we also have a Senate election to cover in the state of South Dakota. Republican incumbent Senator Mike Rounds is running for his second term in the state this year. Rounds is running against a Democratic challenger named Daniel Allers, who is a former member of the South Dakota Senate and the South Dakota House. To learn more about how this election might turn out, let's look at some voter turnout ratios. Let's bring those up right now. So yeah, looking here, we're seeing some pretty bad numbers for Democratic candidates and some increasingly good numbers for Republicans. A very fair question to ask yourself while looking at this chart is, okay, so why is 2010 blanked out? The reason for that is because South Dakota's other senator, John Thune, ran unopposed that year. Thune is also a Republican, and so that speaks volumes about the strength of the Democratic Party in South Dakota when they can't even put a candidate up that year. That enthusiasm advantage for Republicans is further illustrated by their increasing voter turnout ratio from 2014 to 2016, as well as the slight decrease in those same 2 years for Democrats. Okay, let's toss those numbers aside and also consider Mike Rounds' current approval rating in the state. He is, as of this video, enjoying a very good approval rating of plus 16 points. So it would seem that everything is in good order for him to pick up another term, but let's go ahead and turn to Pollbot to make sure of that. Let's calculate those numbers and see if Mike Rounds wins again. Pollbot. And there we have our result. Mike Rounds winning another term by a nearly 26% voter margin. Everything is just going just right for Republicans in the state of South Dakota, and I see no reason to consider this particular race competitive in any way. So let's make that official and put it on our senatorial map right now. Mark it. And now it is time to talk about the presidential election of 2020, starring President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden. When looking at South Dakota's voting history in presidential elections past, I had to go back pretty far, actually specifically to 1964, to see the last time they voted for a Democratic candidate for president. That is the year that Lyndon Johnson beat Barry Goldwater by a very significant margin, and South Dakota was among the many states that went blue that year. But that is the last time, the most recent election, where they voted for a Democratic candidate. More recently, South Dakotans actually elected Trump over Hillary Clinton by about a 30% margin. To understand more about how South Dakotans have been voting for presidents recently, let's pull up some more voter turnout ratios. Let's bring those up right now. So this is a little bit interesting to me. We see, again, better numbers for Republicans in general, but both parties have decreased their enthusiasm by pretty similar margins from 2012 to 2016. Democrats lost about, about 6 percentage points in presidential to House vote ratio, and Republicans lost about 5 percentage points. What this tells me basically is that voters were just more enthused that in the year 2012 to vote for either Barack Obama or Mitt Romney than they were in 2016 to vote for Trump or Hillary Clinton. Regardless, we still see a gap of enthusiasm in favor of Republicans, which is good news for Trump in winning the state for a second time. So let's toss those numbers aside now. The last thing we have to consider to calculate whether or not we think Trump is going to win a second time in South Dakota is his approval rating. As of this video, he is currently sitting at plus 13 in the positive direction for approval rating, meaning that more South Dakotans approve of him than disapprove of him. So considering Trump's wide margin of victory in 2016, his net positive approval rating, and the consistently better presidential to House voter turnout ratios for Republicans, let's look to Pollbot to see by how much Trump is going to win South Dakota. Pollbot. And there you have it, just over 25% is how much Trump is going to win South Dakota over challenger Joe Biden. South Dakota has just been one of the most reliably consistent Republican strongholds over the last decade in this country, and it is absolutely going to Trump a second time. So let's make that official and put it on our presidential map now. Mark it. So all the election results are in now, and they all look great for South Dakotan Republicans. Let's talk briefly about the political future of the Mount Rushmore State in this next section. Let's pull up an old line graph and two new ones and get into this. So looking at raw House turnout numbers, this is actually the same graph I was showing you earlier. Again, we see a positive slope value for that turnout increase for Republicans. Specifically, look at that value preceding X, that 12.5. What that means in the context of this graph is that on average, every election cycle, meaning every 2 years, Republicans have received 12,500 more votes than they received in the previous election cycle. When you compare that number to the Democrats' slope value, specifically that negative 7.3, which means that Democrats have been losing 7,300 voters every election cycle, we see Republicans widening their gap of victory by about 20,000 votes every 2 years going back over the past decade. This spells trouble for the future of Democrats in the state of South Dakota, to say the least. Focusing our attention on these other two line graphs that I've cooked up for you, these represent estimates for the rate of increase or decrease in the senatorial to House voter turnout ratios and presidential to House voter turnout ratios. Where both of these graphs ultimately end up, again, is with a Republican advantage. In the case of general enthusiasm to vote for senatorial candidates, we see Republicans increasing their enthusiasm and Democrats decreasing theirs. In the case of presidential candidates receiving votes, they're both declining in enthusiasm, but the gap between Republicans and Democrats has remained pretty consistent in its margins, meaning that today Republicans still have a pretty decent advantage. Okay, tossing those graphs aside, I think it is safe to say that South Dakota is a very Republican state and has only become more so in recent years and will continue to be that way for at least the next 4 to 8 years, I would imagine. What happens with states generally is they'll hit an inflection point at some time in the future and then start to come back a little bit, but I don't see that happening quite yet for South Dakota. Going in deeper into the 2020s, we're going to see a lot more Republican victories in the state. And that just about does it for our most recent episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button to get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload videos every Monday and Thursday, and I'm also on Twitter, and I do update that account with which state I am going to be covering next ahead of the scheduled release date. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve, Please give me a follow on Twitter, and that link is in the description. Thanks again for watching, and thank you for voting. See you next time.